Good afternoon. This is Regine Webster with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Thank you all so much for joining our webinar today, sponsored by the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, that's going to discuss wildfires and vulnerable populations. As you all know, historic wildfires have really devastated large areas of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Montana this year. And in that Midwest region, over 2 million acres of land have been burned and losses are well into the billions. We know for sure that economic impact is going to be felt for years. But the question remains, what's the human impact and how can we as practitioners mitigate the suffering caused by these fires? Over the next hour, we're going to discuss the Midwest wildfire season and think about and talk about what we can do to help. I also know that the wildfires that are raging in California right now are really top of mind for many, many, many of us. And so while this discussion focuses on the Midwest and its fire season, we certainly hope that the lessons and the thoughts that we discuss here will have applicability over into California. And certainly, I know my heart and the heart of all of my team members at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy is really on California just right now, given the news that we're all seeing coming out of Southern California. Let me go ahead and do a couple bits of housekeeping here. I'm joined by some wonderful women professionals in the field. Nancy Beers is the director of our Midwest Early Recovery Fund with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. She's going to walk you through the fund's roles and goals, but know that she's been with our team for a long time now and is not only an expert in her own right, but she is compassionate beyond all measure. We'll also be joined today by Jessica Stewart-Kuntz, who's the Director of Operations and Grants at the Montana Community Foundation, as well as the Reverend Mary Hughes Gaudreau, who's the Director of Emotional and Spiritual Care at the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. In terms of kind of webinar logistics here, you'll notice on your Zoom platform that at the bottom of the screen, there's a little box that says Q&A. We're going to hold our question and answer time for the end of our webinar, but you all can type your question into the box. It will pop up on my screen. And once we finish our formal conversation and presentations, I'll go ahead and moderate those questions that you pose. So as you hear Nancy and Mary and Jessica, each one of their presentations, I hope you'll take a moment to pose some questions through that Q&A chat box. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Nancy Beers.
Thank you, Regine. Next slide, please. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I know Jessica, Mary, and I are all excited to be sharing with you what we've learned over the past several months about the impact of a season of devastating wildfires impacting a huge part of our 10-state region. And to be candid, I'm pretty sure we would all say we have just barely begun understanding the impact and where our time and talents and resources might make a difference. But we're definitely working on it. Next slide, please. So first, for those of you not familiar with the Early Recovery Fund here at CDP, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to review what it is we do with that program and really how it fits into our conversation today. So it's a Midwest Early Recovery Fund is one of the signature products of CDP. And it's an innovative grant-making program following low-attention disasters, and we'll define those in just a minute. But we actually have prioritized building the capacity locally around our pillar services, which is disaster case management, serving children, outreach, recovery tools, and training and education. Next slide. So we are on the ground funders. We show up in a community after disaster. We do our very best to provide some timely and technical support to try to make the grant-making process as efficient and effective as possible. We try to get our grants out as soon as we can, but we also have to be very cognizant of the community has to be ready for the processes that we're introducing to that community. Next. And we do that work because we know that, especially around low attention disasters, there's a very persistent gap in post-disaster funding. You know, we all know that that early response stage and that emergency stage is pretty well thought out and well funded. But recovery is always a challenge in communities, and especially in low attention disasters where there's very little media coverage. And so we do this with the hope that the most vulnerable people in those communities will get the services they need in a timely manner. Next slide. This slide, I use this every time. This slide is just a reminder also to me that recovery is the most complicated, costly, and under-resourced phase in every disaster. And it lasts for a very long time. For some families, it'll last almost a lifetime. For most families with relatively good resources and who weren't in a challenging situation before a disaster, their recovery cycle will be shortened. But it still pretty much follows this curve, which I would say with fires right now in the Midwest, we're somewhere around that disillusionment stage. So you can see we have a long ways to go. Next slide, please. In the Midwest, we're really used to floods and tornadoes. We have a lot of flooding. We have a lot of lakes and streams and rivers in the Midwest. And of course, we're Tornado Alley, Oklahoma, Kansas, all the way up even to the plains of Minnesota and South and North Dakota. We have plenty of tornadoes to combat every year. But this year has been different. Next slide, please. This year, we've had a lot of droughts and fires. And we've been learning about climate change here in the Midwest for a long time. And this cycle between heavy rain events and droughts has been significant over the last several years. But this year, it's been particularly impactful and has really caused a lot of troubles with fires. Next slide, please. I just wanted to show this slide for those of you who, follow the FEMA system and understand what a FEMA IA grant is and what a FEMA PA grant is and the difference of those resources afforded to communities. I just wanted to make everybody aware that there is a Fire Management Assistant Grant Program, which is much like the FEMA PA program, where states do get 75% of the costs if they apply for this grant from the federal government to mitigate the cost of fighting a fire. Next, please. I just wanted to give you some of our low attention disaster definitions and some of the other definitions we use here with the Early Recovery Fund to just help you paint a picture of why we're interested in these fires. So certainly there's been no FEMA IA declaration for any of these fires in the Midwest. Very limited national coverage, media coverage, and we know that drives funding. Little or no national disaster response organizations have been involved. I would say insufficient community resources and infrastructure. Certainly, Jessica will be talking a lot about that later, about the need for more firefighters, et cetera. Disproportionately affected vulnerable populations. I wouldn't say that farmers would consider themselves vulnerable, but they are so isolated that I think they are more vulnerable than they think. A high percentage of the damage to the population, certainly we've seen some communities completely devastated. Small, rural, and isolated certainly plays in a role here in these rural disasters. And really this lack of community infrastructure. Some of these communities are very small, and some of these communities are 50, 60 miles away from an actual city. Next slide, please. So vulnerable populations, this is our definition here for the Midwest Early Recovery Fund. Certainly uninsured and underinsured homeowners are always vulnerable after a disaster. Certainly all of these other things play into effect also. We have a lot of significant elderly in our rural populations, highly impacted. Certainly some of these farms and some of these communities have been incredibly highly impacted. And, in an area where neighbors are typically helping neighbors, if all of your neighbors have been impacted, who's there to help you? Next, please. And I just wanted to show this slide about what we've been doing for the last 3 years. So we've distributed about a little less than $2.5 million in 48 grants. It's interesting. Can you go back, Kathy? Thank you. The average population of a community we serve is only about 5,000 people. And you can see that the majority of our funding goes for early recovery services, but certainly we have a considerable amount of money also going to education, training, and outreach. Next, please. Thank you. During the early days of March 2017, Oklahoma, Kansas, and parts of Nebraska suffered a series of ongoing wildfires. Oklahoma received 2 of those fire management assistant declarations, as I just pointed out earlier, and Kansas, though, received 7. Kansas had the most significant losses, with over 650,000 acres burned. At least 5,000 cattle died. I've even seen numbers as high as 8,000. And $36 million worth of destroyed fencing. Covering 20 counties in Kansas and impacting 70,000 people, the wildfires resulted in 1 death, 11 injuries, 40 homes destroyed, and hundreds of farm buildings and structures lost, let alone lost equipment. After the wildfires in Kansas subsided, we reached out to the Kansas VOAD members to understand how to help. Much of the discussion revolved around hay and fencing, with many of those needs already met by nonprofit organizations and foundations working in the area. But what are the long-term recovery needs? Just like Regine was saying, you know, that's still a bit of a mystery to us. Farmers and ranchers, we know, are very resilient, often sacrificing their own needs for their land and animals. We are working with a local partner in Kansas, Catholic Charities of Southwest Kansas, to do an unmet needs survey in highly impacted Carter County, and updates to follow on that front. Follow us on our website. We often think of these farm communities as being relatively affluent, but data paints a different picture. In Carter County, the median household income is $33,000 a year, well below the national average of $59,000. And the per capita income is only $17,000, with over 18% of the children living there below poverty guidelines. Next slide, please. In Oklahoma, it was not spared this fire season. In March, wildfires burned hundreds of thousands of acres in northwestern Oklahoma. This rural and sparsely populated area of Oklahoma is ranching country, and fires killed thousands of cows, horses, and other livestock. Unfortunately, this summer, the region also lost individuals to suicide. And you'll hear more about what the Oklahoma Conference on Churches is doing about emotional and spiritual care later from our friend Mary. In Oklahoma, one of the hardest hit communities was Laverne, population 1,300, evacuated for a short time during the worst of the fires. There, the median household income is $32,000 a year, with a staggering 27% of children living below poverty guidelines. These are not wealthy communities, and many of these families were already living on the edge. Next slide, please. From June to September, 1.3 million acres were burned by wildfires across Montana. The severity of this wildfire season was greatly exacerbated by a significant statewide drought. The largest of the more than 50 wildfires consumed more than 250,000 acres alone. Over $280 million had already been spent by August for firefighting, and the fires still lasted another month. The fires claimed the lives of 2 brave firefighters, destroyed homes, businesses, property, and livestock. The entire state suffered months of drought, smoke, and ash. Many residents who were evacuated are also encountering health concerns due to poor air quality. Farmers were forced to sell their livestock months earlier than anticipated due to a lack of feed, impacting workers within the ranching farming industry, as well as suppliers and associated businesses. Reservations have also been highly impacted, with already limited resources being compounded by this fire season. We are so fortunate to have Jessica here today to tell us more about what is happening in Montana in response to these devastating wildfires. Next slide, please. There is some evidence that fires may be more prolific in the future due to changes in the climate. The Montana fires, for example, were caused by a flash drought. Flash drought refers to relatively short periods of warm surface temperature, an abnormal low and rapid decreasing soil moisture. In other words, no moisture plus very warm temperatures and high wind speeds dried the soil and vegetation out very quickly, and with multiple lightning strikes created explosive, fast-spreading fires across much of Montana. Next, please. So what is my general take on these fires in the Midwest, and why are we here today? As disaster recovery specialists, our work in the Midwest has most often centered on tornadoes and floods. which until this year accounted for about 80 to 90% of our natural disasters. As much as we understand the recovery cycle and recovery organizational structures in place to help individuals and families recover from floods and tornadoes, I personally have very little experience in helping communities recover from wildfires. I think that may apply to many disaster recovery specialists in the Midwest. We are just now beginning the stages of this investigation. That is why we're here today. Not to tell you, hey, we have this figured out and we wanted to share with you what we've learned. Far from it. We have just touched the surface of understanding who to connect with, who might be able to help us understand if there are unmet needs, and how we all might be of service to those with those unmet needs. Now we'll be hearing from Jessica. Jessica is the Director of Operations and Grants at the Montana Community Foundation. Next slide, please. She holds a master's degree in public administration with a focus on nonprofit management and rural community development. Jessica works closely with program staff, grant seekers, local community foundations across Montana, and fund partners to streamline grant-making processes and increase strategic grant-making to create lasting philanthropic impact across Montana. She and her husband Jacob live in Helena and enjoy discovering Montana, which is a beautiful place, with their dogs Rainier and Lambert, which I just found out has to do with cherries. Last week, the Midwest Early Recovery Fund partnered with the Montana Community Foundation to host a wildfire workshop. Here's Jessica to tell you more about the Montana wildfires and the meeting we hosted last week.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Jessica in Montana, and there's lots of snow on the ground, but there are still wildfires being fought on the High Line, so there's that. I'm so grateful to be here, and I think I just want to point out that when Nancy was sharing my bio with all of you, it didn't say anything about disaster or fires. So I am not an expert. I have learned a lot in the last 3 months. I'm grateful for this partnership. I wanted to start out by giving a little bit of context to how we ended up partnering with the Midwest Recovery Fund and CDP and taking on the wildfire season and recovery. We were reached out to by donors across the state who are interested in giving to support disaster recovery. And we didn't really know what to do except for to say yes. And as we said yes, money continued to come in. And we were able to establish a non-permanent fund to hold money. We are currently granting out of those funds. And thankfully, I know someone who knows Regine, and Regine was able to put me in contact with Nancy. And I just think it's funny because as I got the email from her to connect with Nancy, I was sitting in a meeting that Nancy was presenting in Kansas. So it was very, it was kismet. I think that's the term. Anyway, we were able to connect with Nancy and figure out how we might be able to better serve Montana in the recovery process. To give you a little bit of context about our wildfire season, Nancy set me up really, really well, so I won't get too deep into it. But I think one of the most important points when it comes to Montana and fires in general is that 90% of our fire departments are volunteer fire departments. That means they do not get paid. They buy their own equipment. They buy their own gear. They volunteer their time. 90% of all of our fire departments across the state, which means that the majority of the first responders when it comes to wildfire season are volunteers. They're also the folks that fight fires the longest. They don't have the required rotation that the federal firefighters for the federal government have. So they're out there for a month or 2 months sometimes, especially this year. The other things I want to make sure to point out is because the fire stretched over to 1.225 million acres, that's from every corner of Montana. we always have wildfires. Oftentimes they're just in forested areas, but this year we had them across Montana and affecting from agriculture, from our ranching community, livestock, to our forests near Glacier and in Glacier National Park, where every dollar that those rural communities make is in tourism, and they did not have a tourism season this year. We will see the effects of the wildfire season for years to come, from the secondary trauma that Mary will talk more about, to the economic impact of rural communities who will be recovering for quite some time. You can move to the next slide. The pictures I have here are actually pictures from our workshop, from the folks that presented and shared with us different talked about different topics relative to their communities and their wildfire season. The top picture is the smoke in Missoula County. Missoula County is in a bowl, so the particulate matter in the smoke was some of the worst in the nation. Folks were evacuated from Missoula County due to the Lolo Peak and Rice Ridge fires for some for 6 weeks. This is not an Instagram photo that was doctored. This is what the smoke actually looked like in those communities for weeks. And most folks in those communities do not have access to air purifiers or any resources, for that matter, to help with smoke, and living in that smoke for weeks at a time. The lower photo is from the Caribou Fire, which is in Eureka, which is in the western corner of Montana. This is this community experienced the most structural devastation. They're incredibly resilient. Our largest Amish community in Montana was impacted quite a bit. They lost a lot of buildings, but immediately rebuilt houses. And we were lucky enough in our workshop last week to have one of the pastors from a local church in Eureka talk about their efforts to rebuild their community. Next slide. The lower picture on the left is of Seeley Lake. This is the Rice Ridge Fire. This was one of our largest fires in Montana, and the Seeley Lake community, this highway that this picture is taken on, is a highway that will drive you directly to Glacier National Park, which, if you haven't been, I suggest going. They were evacuated for 6 weeks, and this is what the smoke looked like. Again, this isn't a doctored photo. This is the reality that folks were living in, and they faced even more challenges because there was a lot of news coverage that used the title in the news, the headline, "Seeley Lake is closed," when they actually weren't closed. But folks didn't go to Seeley Lake. The smoke was bad enough, but then to have your marketing campaign be "Seeley Lake is closed," it affects a rural community's economy, and they have a very resilient community. Again, Montana is full of resilient people. They're small businesses that are already struggling and anticipate an ongoing struggle to keep their folks employed, and to also just make it to summer, where they hopefully can recoup some of their losses. The other picture, this is a large photo that kind of takes in the expanse of the Rice Ridge Fire. This was the fire that happened in eastern Montana and affected our ranching community. This community has their deepest concerns are secondary trauma and the potential increase in suicide. Montana already has one of the highest rates of suicide in the country. And as Nancy talked about, ranchers and farmers are very resilient, but there is an undercurrent of needs that are often not addressed. And the community, quite a few community members in eastern Montana see the risk of increased suicide and unmet needs relative to emotional and spiritual health. So we're hoping that some of the outcomes from the work that we're doing in partnership with the Midwest Recovery Fund and CDP take on some of those issues. Next slide. This is our workshop. So in mid-October, Nancy and I started talking, and Montana Community Foundation decided to take on the task of partnering with the Midwest Recovery Fund and hosting a workshop on early recovery. We had no idea what we were doing, And I'm really excited. I don't know what to compare it to, but we're really excited about the outcomes so far. And it was really wonderful to come to work on Monday and have an email inbox full of folks from across Montana expressing their deep gratitude for the opportunity to connect with others and talk about recovery. So thank you, Nancy, for providing us with that platform to be able to do that. I want to tell you a little bit about the folks in the photo because I think it'll illustrate the diversity of folks we were able to bring together. Montana, as you know, is a huge state, and getting people in one place from across the state tends to be very challenging. So we were really excited to have representation from literally every corner in Montana. You'll see the photo on the left is Kathy, who is from the Lodgepole Complex fire, which I just showed you the photo of. She was a part of fundraising efforts to bring in hay and fencing to Lodgepole and address some of the direct service needs that those community members have. They had $15 million in fencing that needed to be replaced and 1,400 miles of fencing. Ranchers are still being forced to sell off their cattle in order to survive, and also because all the graze land is burned, so there's no place for cattle to graze. This is going to cause incredible economic impact in those communities for quite some time. Kathy was able to present as well as share some of her knowledge. We also have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was able to present on climate change and the drought that was experienced in some parts of Montana. In eastern Montana, for instance, it was the worst drought on record. In other parts, it was one of the worst droughts. But in eastern Montana, specifically Garfield County, where the Lodgepole Complex fire took place, it was the worst drought in history. In the lower right corner, we have the volunteer fire chief, Chief Clyde Miller, along with one of the executives from one of our statewide news agencies. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea of who was in attendance. We had 68 people attend from across the state. And I think we'll move straight into the outcome. So we had panelists present as well as speakers present, and then we finished the day off with trying to develop to answer some questions that will help us formulate next steps and how to move forward. I know when I was inviting people and trying to urge them to come, one of the concerns they had is that we would come together, have a conversation, and that would be the end of it. Rural communities, no matter where we are in the country, have that experience. Outsiders come in, they want to help. And even though I'm in Montana, for most of these people, I am an outsider. I live in the capital. I do not live in their communities. So to be able to bring people together and assure them that this was not just a one-hit wonder sort of feel-good experience, but we really wanted to dig deep and figure out what recovery looks like for Montana. Next slide. So we asked some questions and we got some answers. We had Post-its up on the wall that folks could write down their own answers. And then Nancy and I were able to facilitate some deeper discussion. So these are the challenges that folks identified when it comes to wildfire recovery. They're concerned about preparedness, individuals as well as organizations not being prepared for what to do in response to future wildfires, as well as how to recover. People not being prepared as far as decision-making goes. The public not being educated. This comes to fire safety as well as smoke and its impact on health, as well as what recovery resources are available. Just an overall general preparedness. The term sandbox for organizations was used. This is really just where the go-to place for resources and the variety and diversity of organizations involved in wildfires. There is a serious challenge as far as communication goes. Who's doing what, how they're doing it, and what resources are available. Our our panelists from Missoula County who took that picture of the smoke I showed you earlier was very concerned that there wouldn't be future smoke and that would lead to a loss of momentum. So if you don't see smoke next year, if you don't smell it, then it doesn't exist and you're fine. And then folks won't be prepared to protect themselves in the future. The rhetoric that, excuse me, that wildfires are a part of summer is another challenge, that folks won't take this seriously. They won't take climate change seriously. They won't take the increase in wildfire seriously. The experts in the room know that this is just the beginning, that we're going to face much more challenging summers ahead. There is, across every question that we posed to the group, every discussion that was had, always came back to a lack of volunteers, because 90% of our wildfires and all of our fires are fought by departments that are 100% volunteer. We lack volunteers, especially young volunteers. There are, as you can see, there's a number, and I'm sure you've all been able to take a look, and we can have follow-up questions later, but we have under-resourced emergency management in rural communities, folks not knowing what's available to them, and not a common, cohesive operating picture for how to recover, what resources are available from the state to local government to nonprofits. So really being able to improve communication strategies and share in the planning process, I think, were big challenges that were identified across the groups represented at Friday's workshop. Next slide. So opportunities. There are some clear opportunities that were identified in the group: increased preparedness and education. So many organizations involved in response and recovery. And this is, again, goes back to that communication. There's so many involved, and how do we really utilize all of those involved? It's really, I think people were really encouraged. They had no idea. And I'm still getting emails about this. I had no idea how many people were involved in the recovery process. I had no idea how many people responded. So then being able to connect those people so that they can participate in recovery together rather than working siloed across the state, which then is connected to that later on down the list, building relationships proactively between residents, fire departments, county agencies, just across the gamut. We also learned about local emergency planning committees. Most folks in the room were not aware, but these are actual committees that are established by counties. In every county, they have one. So the idea that these committees exist, but folks don't realize these resources are available, points to a need, again, to improve communication and utilize these committees in the recovery process and make sure that in future discussions they're brought to the table. Next slide. So we asked folks what their aha moments are. Oh, we need volunteers. I think it was really important that this continued to come up and it was stressed as much as it was, because while we know that we have a lot of volunteer fire crews, we don't often think about the long term and how many of those volunteer fire crews are older. They're like 65-year-old men. And what happens when they are no longer able to participate, and how do we keep the momentum going? So that was a good conversation, a rich conversation that came out of Friday's discussion. And again, a directory of resources, who's doing what from every agency and organization, and how can we communicate so that there is a basic, the sandbox term that was used earlier, but really like a clearinghouse of resources. Next slide. So these are questions that folks want to know more about, and I think that we'll use this again going forward in the next steps that we take in our partnership with the Midwest Recovery Fund. But again, I think it's just interesting. Even before the workshop started, I was having conversations with potential panelists. They said, I just don't know who's doing what. We still don't know who's doing what. We don't know what's available across the state. And some of that challenge is that Montana is so big and so rural. And some of it, I think, is just, from what I have seen in the last 3 months, really, regardless of where you are, people just respond quickly, and then you're not aware of what people have done and what still needs to be done and what's available to help it happen. Which really covers what folks want to know more about going forward, and it gives us some ideas of conversations that we can have in further discussions with participants. Next slide. I'm going over. I am going to wrap it up. So these are folks that we had folks identify who they want to bring to the table next time. And we have this will be so helpful as we move forward and we continue the conversation, and then we make sure that every kind of stakeholder is at the table. The folks that we're missing from the conversation and the areas where we need more representation from specific communities. So we'll make sure to take this under consideration as we make future plans. Next slide. And then here we have really clear ideas of what we didn't discuss and what needs to be discussed. And this will help us build an agenda for future conversations. The top two are really stood out to me. Just understanding the unmet needs of children who were traumatized by wildfires, especially in the Caribou Fire, the Rice Ridge Fire, and the Lodgepole Complex Fire, where there are so many children in those communities. In the Seeley Lake area where the Rice Ridge Fire was, we had kids who were had to have school in a resort, which was wonderful, but they had to drive an hour in a school bus in order to get to school for the first several weeks of school because the smoke was so bad. So being able to understand how we can better meet the needs of children in the recovery process and see how they're so resilient, but see how we can be the best advocates and allies for Montana's young people. Next slide. Okay, so where does this leave us? We are really excited about the outcomes, as I'm sure I have shared. We have community members across Montana representing nearly every sector who are eager to continue the conversation, and everyone who participated in Friday's workshop was very eager to keep the conversation going. I put together a survey yesterday that will go out to all the participants to get further feedback from them that maybe wasn't shared at the group level. And Nancy and I will begin discussion of the potential or what a second workshop will look like. It will likely focus on those things that were not discussed and the challenges and opportunities that were discussed. So we can dig deeper into those and hopefully come up with a plan for Montana and what recovery looks like. Nancy and I were also able to talk about the potential for taking some resources and spending some time in the Seeley Lake area, and then also in Garfield County where the Lodgepole Complex Fire was, where there's really clear identified concern about secondary trauma and kids and how we can help in that recovery process. So I look forward to our future plans. All of this happened really suddenly, and we're really excited that we as at Montana Community Foundation can be a resource for folks and the facilitator and the convener when it comes to how we can recover and develop a more resilient state. So thank you for having me. I'm sorry I went over time.
Well, thank you, Jessica. You know, you're very enthusiastic, and that showed at the meeting as well. And you put together such a great guest list for that meeting. It was really, really great. Now we're going to hurry up and get over to Mary. Mary Gaudreau is one of my favorite people in the recovery sector that I've gotten to know over the last several years. Mary serves as the Director of Emotional and Spiritual Care for the Oklahoma Conference on Churches. She's responsible for OCC's Disaster Spiritual and Emotional Care Ministries, facilitating OCC's training and credentialing of local spiritual care responders who are actively engaged in addressing disaster-related spiritual and emotional needs. I'm not going to take more time to tell you about Mary. I can just tell you that she has been active in this field for years, at least 20 years, and she is a very important part of the national conversation, especially at the national VOAD level, and was very important in writing the points of consensus for the National VOAD Spiritual and Care Committee of VOAD. So, Mary, with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nancy, thank you for that introduction. And Jessica, thank you for that good presentation. We really appreciate the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for pulling us together and helping us to be able to compare and learn from each other specific to different types of disaster. I do work with Oklahoma Conference of Churches, and I'll go through these slides fairly quickly. So next slide. We've been the state's ecumenical agency since 1972. We have 16 core Christian denominations, interfaith partners, and we represent about 1,200 individual houses of worship. We have a wonderful group of communion leaders, our bishops, our regional ministers that meet regularly, and they work together to help us advocate together for the needs of the state. And we represent about 28 to 30% of the population of Oklahoma. So having those kind of networks is very helpful in disasters. We have a team of about 180 credentialed local spiritual care responders representing about 32 denominations and interfaith partners. And we are piloting the National BOAD Disaster Spiritual Care Guidelines right here in Oklahoma. That has been incredibly helpful for us. Next slide, please. As we have dealt with disasters. Now, this is a little outdated, but the darker the red, the more federally declared disasters. And you can see Oklahoma right there in the middle, right above Texas. We have a lot of red. Obviously, the disasters that we are dealing with today, we've already mentioned, were not federally declared. So many of the disasters Oklahoma deals with are not federally declared. We can look at the next slide, please. These are the 16 disasters we've dealt with in Oklahoma since March of 2015. And you can see, again, many of those are not, do not receive a presidential declaration, but we do have this one in 2017 that we're specifically dealing with for this particular webinar today, the March 2017 wildfires. So next slide, please. As we're responding to the 2017 Northwest Oklahoma wildfires, there's a picture straight from the field. If we can have the next slide, please. This is an image from NASA from March 7th, 2017. The red is imaging of heat, and you can see the smoke showed up as well on the satellite picture there. So these are the wildfires that we were actually dealing with, and if you can imagine how large they were on this particular day, just to be able to see them from satellite imagery. So next slide, please. So a number of the early factors that we discovered through our networks, because we do have so many disasters in Oklahoma, we have such solid networks. These are some of the complicating factors that we heard early on, as well as we continue to hear. And that include the loss of livestock, the financial impact related to that, the risk of surviving livestock related to grazing land and not having hay. There were lots of projects to be able to get hay into the hands of those ranchers. Fencing, and there were also delays in installing fencing because of erosion concerns. So they had to wait till they had a little bit of rain to be able to have a little bit of the foundation for the fences to be able to stay in. So they were concerned about erosion. There were needs as well for milk replacers for those cattle ranchers as well. We also discovered the loss of fire equipment, as Jessica mentioned. These are voluntary firefighters, and much of the equipment was damaged as well. And primarily, the project that we're doing with Oklahoma Conference of Churches relates to this exposure to the psychological trauma as well. So not only were people experiencing life-threatening trauma themselves as they were escaping the wildfire, perhaps, there's many stories that are emerging, but also just this continued exposure to the destruction of their own livestock was very traumatic for first responders, as well as for those who were just having to put down some of their injured animals, and even some of the wildlife that was suffering that they had to be dealing with as well. Now, this last one that I've listed here is this high-risk population. This is a major concern for us. What we know, and there was a study that just came out from Iowa University in June of 2017 about how farmers and ranchers, those in agriculture, are disproportionately at high risk for suicide. And some of the statistics here are really of concern. We hear anecdotally from some of our networks that we expect that there have been 2 suicides, perhaps a third, directly related to the wildfire. The suicide rates among the agricultural community are the highest of any occupational group. And it's even increased since the farm crisis of the 1980s. So our concern, of course, there is that typically one of the primary factors related to suicidality occurs when stressors like economic challenges occur. And this is, again, new information that's come out from the University of Iowa. So we're highly concerned about this population. Next slide, please. The good news that I have for you is that we have several things in place to be able to address the emotional and spiritual concerns in the northwestern part of the state. we have a very, very strong and experienced state VOAD with all of those disasters that you saw on the slide over the last couple of years. We work together well. At one point, I believe we had 13 long-term recovery groups going at one time in the state. So we have a routine down for how we're going to address long-term needs in general. We have a very strong emotional and spiritual care committee as well that works closely together with our strong mental health and faith-based collaboration. We had disaster spiritual care providers from OCC in that faith-based collaboration working with mental health providers, local representatives that were giving us good information immediately back. What's going on in the field? What's happening in terms of the stress levels and the trauma levels in that area? And we also had this really tight network with adjudicatory leaders that comes through the Oklahoma Conference of Churches, where we were able to get other information as well, directly from those local faith communities that were responding and right in the communities that were affected. We also, I would say as well, that there's a strong sense of pride and culture and a culture of self-sufficiency. So there's this resilience of the local communities. Now that has two sides to it, because one of the common issues in long-term recovery, as we know, is that there is this shame at needing help. It comes up in all kinds of disasters, and this frustration with the loss of control. And so while there's a strong sense of resiliency in local communities and pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, there's also sometimes a tendency to not ask for help when it's necessary. So that's actually a double-sided issue. There were very effective agricultural-related communities. For example, the county extension offices, the Cattlemen's Foundation, Department of Agriculture, Forestry Department, and of course our Oklahoma Emergency Management that was working with all of those together. So we had some pre-existing assets as well. And I would also say that the agricultural community in general, outside of Oklahoma, was very, very supportive, bringing in hay and other resources for the others in the farm community as well. Next slide. So why the Oklahoma Conference of Churches? Why is it that we're doing the work that we're doing? And basically, faith communities are there before, during, and after the disasters. And what I'm hearing from our faith-based affiliates is this news that perhaps there is already a spike in suicidality. And the fact is that we're very aware of what happened in the 1980s. We are concerned about who is on the front lines of being able to respond in that way. And we know our faith community leaders are going to be very involved in their communities in general. So I learned that the Oklahoma Conference of Churches was actually a core sponsor for the 1985 AgLink Coalition, and it established a statewide crisis telephone line in the 1980s. So we already have a history of being able to address the agricultural needs related to suicidality going way back. We also know that I've been working nationally for quite some time as well and have helped develop resources, but we don't seem to have a very good ability to have a community assessment. What is the community's long-term emotional and spiritual care need? We can set plans. We've already had a meeting actually in April with our Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, went up with some of our leadership, and we met with the faith-based leaders and the mental health community to talk about what the needs would be. But the fact is that we needed an ability to assess actually what's going on in long-term emotional and spiritual care, and we couldn't find it. So we're creating that here among a number of other resources that we have within the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. We know that we have this strong collaborative relationship with mental health and our VOAD partners. I'm personally an ordained clergy as well as licensed mental health, and so we already have that existing relationship, and it seems to be helpful for us as we are developing this plan going forward. We also have the strong existing local and statewide networks. So if you have 16 bishops or judicatory leaders or regional ministers that have individual houses of worship all across the state, we already have those existing networks in place, and that tends to be helpful for us as well. Next slide. So here's our plan. What we know is that emotional and spiritual care needs often emerge around 3 to 10 months after a disaster. We also know that not only the life-threatening trauma that people might have experienced, but also the cumulative stress could be emerging at this time. And what we are doing with the help of the Midwest Recovery Fund is to create and implement a specialized community emotional and spiritual care assessment so that our VOAD, nonprofit, and government partners can develop an effective response to emerging and existing emotional and spiritual care needs. That's our plan. And we will create that assessment. We're in the midst of doing that as well. All disasters are local. And so we're going to create that based upon what the community thinks that they need as well. Next slide, please. This is the expected timeline for this project. So to date, we've already done research and networking with community and government leaders. We've had a lot of conversations, and we have, again, our local affiliates as well as our wonderful partners with Oklahoma Emergency Management and the County Emergency Management and many others. So we're doing the researching and networking up to this point. And then this month, we are going to start meeting with the community leaders and stakeholders about what information they need and the questions that they would ask. So because all disasters are local, we want to know what ideas they have. Now, I have many, many, many resources in terms of doing assessments for trauma and outlines for how you might plan a long-term recovery. But what we really need is to put that in a package for this particular community, customized for this particular community based upon what they think that they need. In January, we will refine that survey, plan and continue our data gathering. And January through mid-February, we will gather the data through interviews and group meetings. We're already starting some of those interviews as well. And then February through mid-March, we'll interpret that data and set goals for stage 2. Now, let me give one little clarification here. We are having meetings next week, but I would also clarify that if we begin hearing some significant concerns about suicidality, we won't wait until mid-March to begin to address those. That is a very significant concern that we have. If we start hearing that that is a problem, then we'll go ahead and jump ahead to some of the ideas we have for stage 2. So next slide, please. The preliminary plan for stage 2 is to schedule additional trainings for local community, school, and faith community leaders, specifically about suicide prevention, psychological first aid, mental health first aid. And we have basically a planning grid already in the works for direct outreach to affected populations. But we're going to wait until we see what the assessment indicates before we decide exactly what the needs are there. Because, of course, what makes the most sense is to hear what the community needs rather than us coming in from the outside of the community and telling the community what they need. Next slide, please. So that's basically the very quick overview of what we're doing in this project, and we're very thankful for the support we have to be able to meet the needs.
Mary, thank you so much for this incredibly powerful presentation, and I'll echo my thanks as well to Nancy Beers for her overview of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund and the work she undertakes there, as well as our presentation from Jessica Stewart-Kuntz. Just incredible the way that you're navigating the wildfire discussion in Montana. What I like so much about this conversation is that the three of you have different and yet so complementary perspectives and expertise as it relates to the wildfire season in the Midwest. And I'm just really so thrilled and thankful for the three of you for your time and your talents that you've brought to us today. I think I'll close the way I started it, which is that this fire season, be it in the Midwest or in California like we're seeing now, has just been incredibly devastating. And to see through Nancy and Jessica and Mary how it has directly affected the individuals who've been affected by these wildfires is really compelling and definitely drives us to action. For all of you who are on the webinar today, thank you so much for your time as well. Certainly, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to Nancy. She can be reached at nancy.beers@disasterphilanthropy.org. And certainly if any questions that you have for Mary or Jessica arise, I know that Nancy will make sure to connect you all together. Before I say adieu, I'll go ahead and wish you all a very happy holiday season. Keep your loved ones close during the holiday season, especially given the havoc that disasters has wreaked on on our country this year. So keep your loved ones close, have a happy holiday, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions for us. My thanks to you all.